Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the panel Are We Living in an Illusion? A fresh look of the importance of bank capital in the quest of stability, for which we have the special participation of Dr. Fernando Moreira, and we will now leave you with Professor Julie Gomez, who will be moderating the session. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome everyone to Cátedra Europa. Thank you, Fernando, for accepting our invitation to join our conversation with the conference titled Are We Living in an Illusion? A fresh look at the importance of bank capital in the quest for stability. Dr. Fernando Moreira is a senior lecturer, associate professor in banking and risk management, and co-director of the Center for Service Excellence at the University of Edinburgh Business School, where from 2015 to 2017, he also acted as the director of the Master in Science in Banking and Risk. His research interests include the impact of financial regulation on a number of issues such as economic growth and banks' risk-taking and methodological approaches to assess causality. He has previously worked at Keele University at UK as a lecturer in finance and at the Central Bank of Brazil. Thank you once again for your valuable intervention. And without further ado, I give way to our guest. Welcome, Fernando.
Okay, thank you, Yuli. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen, but I hope everyone can see the screen now. Banks are something so important to everyone. So that's why I decided to give this talk. Choose this topic. Even though I'm going to use a bit of statistics, but I'm conscious that perhaps some people in the audience are not experts in statistics. So I'm going to try to give the intuition behind of what I'm doing so that everyone can follow the ideas. So related to the title, some things looks so obvious. For example, you can see a kind of picture where we have four horizontal lines. Then I would ask you, are those lines straight, like parallel? Okay, our eyes would tend to see non-parallel lines, but in fact, trust me, they are parallel, meaning they are horizontal. One like they are in the same slope. So this could illustrate a situation that we have in banking regulation. Because for those who work in the area or have read about it, bank capital is something essential that regulators believe to control the health of banks. So it has been so for around 200 years. But is that true? Is that what I am asking in the title of this presentation? Would it be illusion like this, the picture you can see on your screen now? Or is it really true? If we control bank capital, we would control banks' financial situation. Nowadays, regulators, academics, and people in banks, they believe that we actually should control capital so that banks would be safe. Capital could affect stability, which here is represented by probability of default, which means like the possibility that a bank would fail, in two ways. First of all, we have this direct relationship going from capital to probability of default or probability of failure. That's a direct, intuitive, or even by definition relationship, because we could say that a bank would fail only if the losses would cover or would be bigger than its capital. So it sounds obvious that the more capital a bank has, the lower the probability that that particular bank would fail. But there's also another path or channel that would link capital to probability of default. What many papers or textbooks say is that if we increase capital, shareholders or the owners of the banks would have more to lose. Because of that, the bank's owners would be like more conservative. They would be afraid of lose more money, and they would control risk taking, because if you reduce risk taking, you would reduce the possibility of losses, and as a consequence, we would reduce probability of default. So we have two channels, this direct channel and the indirect channel via skin in the game, which means like the fear of the bank's owners to lose the additional capital they added to the bank. So this is the basic intuition why most people believe that capital is essential in banking regulation. However, the situation is not that simple. Apart from this initial hypothesis, which I showed in the previous slide, it's showed here in the first part of this slide. Okay, more capital could lead to lower probability of default. That's our main hypothesis, which many people believe. But also, we know that capital is more expensive than that. Like when I say that, it could be like deposits or other types of investment people do in banks. Because capital is more expensive in terms of paying dividends, perhaps it would be possible that banks would increase risk-taking to try to get higher return and pay dividends. So we would have a theoretical foundation to propose the possibility that more capital could actually lead to higher probability of default. But also there are other papers showing that the relationship is unclear. It depends on other things, other factors. For example, the type of institutions, how much capital they have, the ownership structure, and so on. But there's also other authors showing that it's possible that capital instability are independent, meaning that, okay, there are other factors that we do not observe that would be driving capital instability. So we may see some correlation, but it's not because they have a direct relationship between them. Using the data I'm going to mention later on in my empirical analysis, if we run an initial test, let's say it, between probability of default, which is here as PD, and I have like probability of failure or default in 4 time windows. Like here, PD1M is the probability that banks would fail next month. So M stands for month. Here is the probability of failing in 3 months, here in 6 months, and here in 1 year. And in the vertical column, the first column, we have 3 measures of capital. Here is equity, common and preferred equity or shares. The second one is the total regulatory capital. Okay, for people who are not in the area, what's the difference between the first and the second one? Broadly speaking, is because regulators accept other items like other types of debt, like long-term debt, that they call capital, but they are not share. So I'm also studying the potential impact of increasing the total regulatory capital on PD, probability of default. And the last one is more concentrated on common equity, what we call tier one. It's just one of the levels of capital in the regulation. So what I found is that for any correlation across these measures, we have negative values, statistically significant, which means that we could conclude that, okay, the more capital a bank has, the lower the probability of default, which is what regulators and many academics would expect. So if that's true, I could finish my presentation here. And we would conclude that regulators are correct and banks should increase capital as much as possible so that they would be safe and we as depositors would be safe as well. However, capital is what we call endogenous in statistical language. What does that mean? It means that when we have data on capital and probability of default, we may observe some correlation, as I showed you on the previous slide. But that correlation is not necessarily coming from the relationship between or from capital to probability of default. It could be the case that two situations. There are some things that we do not observe, or we don't collect data, or we do not have data that could be driving both capital and probability of default. That would result in the same situation as before in terms of correlation. That's a kind of case where we would also have correlation. But even if you didn't have a direct relationship from capital to probability of default. Another problem in the question I proposed is that the relationship could actually go from probability of default to capital, meaning that as bank managers observe that the probability of default is increasing or decreasing, they could adjust capital accordingly. So that would not be what I'm looking for, because I'm trying to specify or confirm if more capital would lead to lower probability of default. So that is the main problem I have in this case as in terms of an empirical empirical analysis. For those who are if we have students in the audience and you use or maybe using statistics, econometrics, regressions in the future, I assume that most of you are going to have to deal with this potential problem. We call it endogeneity. Unless, okay, when you want to predict things, that is okay, because you are not worried about impact, effect, or causality. So in those cases, endogeneity would not be a problem. But if you want to prove some correlation or causation, or if you want to convince someone like your teacher, your boss, when you have a job, you have to tell them how you treated endogeneity, which is what I just showed on this slide. So those two possibilities, an observed factors driving both variables, capital and probability of default, in my case, or the relationship going in the opposite direction, opposite to what you want to show people. So what do I want to do in this study? Actually, I want to check if capital really impacts financial stability, probability of default. And as a second objective, even capital affects PD or doesn't affect it, I want to test other factors used by bank supervisors and regulators and check if perhaps those other factors would also impact probability of default. So why is this important? Why is this novel, original? I believe in treating endogeneity in terms of capital and probability of default in a better way than other papers in the area. And also, I'm going to shed light on the direction of the relationship between capital and probability of default, which many academic papers don't do. So we have the possibility that more capital leads to more stability, more capital would lead to less stability, or stability and capital are independent. So we observe correlation, but in terms of effect, neither of them affects each other. So my empirical analysis. I use international sample of banks in 51 countries. The period is from 1990 to 2018. I use annual frequency because the way I'm going to build some of the variables I need for my analysis, I need annual data. So that's why I choose annual frequency, because in this area, we have quarterly data as well, which is sometimes better because it gives us more data. But in my case, I need annual data. Just for your information, you can see here the data sources, where I got the data I am using. So methods, which is a key element of my presentation, because I'm claiming that I can treat endogeneity better than other researchers. So as I want to try to show a causal link between capital and stability, i.e. probability of default, I'm going to focus on changes in capital and changes in probability of default. Why is it more intuitive? It's more intuitive because if I find, for example, that a particular change in capital causes a particular change in stability, could be negative or positive. So it's easier to present the results to regulators or bankers. So I could say it's like if I say that if you change your capital by 1%, like increasing 1%, that's what happened to stability in terms of change. So it's how stability is going to change because of the change in capital. So I think it's easier to explain. It's more intuitive. And one additional note, for those who read the papers in finance, economics, or even in other social science areas, you may have seen a lot of cases where independent variables, meaning the variables on the right-hand side of the equal sign, are lagged, meaning they are in the past, so that the authors can claim that their results are not affected by the reverse causality, which is, like in my case, the relationship going from PD to capital, which I don't want. But okay, it's an interesting trick, but in many cases, it's not realistic. It may help people to publish papers, but sometimes they don't have economic meaning. And in my case, I believe that the relationship between capital and probability of default happen with those factors at the same time. So at the same time that shareholders or owners are observing capital increasing or decreasing, they could put pressure on managers in terms of increasing or decreasing risk taking. So everything is happening at the same time, which makes our lives much harder because we should not or cannot use lagged variables. The first method is what we call fixed effects. Again, no panic if you never heard about it, but I'm going to tell you the main intuition why I'm using this kind of regression here. It's not the best one, but it's just initial test because it only controls for unobserved factors, as I showed in a diagram at the beginning of my presentation, but unobserved factors that do not change over time. So, for example, I'm saying that those things that we do not observe could be like managers' skills, bank culture, bank strategy, assuming that they don't change over time. So, if that is something that would be driving both changes in PD and changes in capital, I'm controlling for that, and the coefficient beta 1 that I'm going to find in this regression would show impact, no, not only correlation. So here we have delta, meaning change. Change in PD is equal to some variables. The main variable here is changing in capital, so delta C. It would be good if you could remember those two notations, because I'm going to mention them a lot of time in the remaining reminder of my presentation. So we have change in PD as a function of changes in capital, and some control variables that are used by, for example, supervisors, and that are found to be important by other researchers. So here we have just briefly what we call camels. It's used, for example, in the United States by bank supervisors. So is to show the quality of banks, the health of banks. So you have capital adequacy, so it's how much capital banks have. So note that here we have changes in capital in a particular period for bank I. Here is just the total amount of capital. Here is asset quality, management quality, earnings, liquidity. This is sensitivity to market risk. Like, okay, they first we had camel, but they needed another letter to represent market risk. M was gone, so they added S and created like sensitivity to market risk to form the word camels. And size, we know that bank size is very important in terms of probability of default, and some country-specific controls. Here, these other Greek letters show the bank fixed effects. That what I showed, I mentioned before, like bank culture, manager skills for each bank. Here are country-specific fixed effects. So things related to countries represented by J that do not change over time. So could it be like the culture of the financial market in that particular country, political issues, I mean, at least those that are fixed over time. So time fixed effects represent things that may change in a particular year, like new regulations that could affect probability of default of banks. The second method, which is a little bit better in terms of what it can do, is called instrumental variables. In a nutshell, a summary for those who never heard about this. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to propose one or more variables called IV, so which is here, to try to estimate changes in capital. So this is the first regression in this method, which we call first stage. And after I estimate delta C, changes in capital in this first step, I'm going to use that delta C hat, which is the estimated value, to see what happens in terms of the relationship between delta C and delta PD. So in this case, gamma 1 would be seen as a effect, not only correlation, because delta C was estimated from an instrumental variable that I'm going to try to convince you that is not related to those unobserved factors that we saw before. So it's something we would call exogenous, coming from outside the system. So the changes in capital would be caused by something that is not related to probability of default, and therefore we could interpret this coefficient as a causal coefficient. So what are my instruments? I'm going to build more than one variable using the intuition, or based on the intuition that banks suffer pressure from regulators and from the market when they are setting or allocating their capital. The first measure is for bank I at time t minus 1, like previous year compared to the period we are interested in. We reduce the level of capital of that bank from the average in the whole country where the bank is. And then we multiply by the standard deviation by capital in that country, in this bank system of country J. So, okay, why is this an instrument for capital? Okay, because the lower is this first part of the number, the more pressure the bank would have to increase capital in the next year. So the lower is C for bank I compared to the average of the market, the worse is its situation, and they have pressure to increase capital next year. And especially from this paper here, Marcus 1983, he shows that if we have a situation in a country where the standard deviation of capital for all banks is like very small, meaning that all results are concentrated, any bank deviating or going away from that block of data, it can be very easily identified. So when the standard deviation is small in the country, that is very bad for banks, because if one bank is quite different, going to the left in terms of having lower capital, it can be very easily spotted by regulators or by investors. So it means that though both numbers, when they are small, they are bad for that particular bank. So I expect that this IV would have a negative relationship with changes in capital next year, like year T. I built a similar instrumental variable using the percentile. It's like the rank, as if the bank checked like the list of banks in terms of capital from the highest to the lowest and checked their position compared to all banks in country J. The lower the position, the worse. So the bank would have more pressure to increase capital next year. In summary, my IV or IVs, they are directly related to capital, which is the first condition to have a good IV, because of what I told you before. So it's related because of the pressures on banks to increase capital. Second condition, the relationship from the IV to PD should be only through the channel of the endogenous variable, capital. So in this case, because of the formula, in the way I built the formula, it seems that the only way that we can connect DIV to PD is via C. And this U here would be like for each bank, for characteristics that we do not observe for each bank. Because the IV is built using the average of the whole market and the standard deviation of the whole market, it's highly unlikely that something that comes from the average of the market would be related to something that is particular to each bank. So those are the three conditions, and because of that, I believe that this IV is theoretically valid. Another method is what we call structural equation modeling, and I'm going to illustrate it here. I hope everyone can see it. Actually, I create scenarios. For example, the first one is the most intuitive one. Changes in capital going to changes in probability of default. The second one in panel B is the relationship going from delta changes in PD to changes in capital, so the opposite direction. Panel C and D, they assume that there's something that we do not observe, U, like unobserved factors, but also there are some relationships directing delta C to delta PD, or in panel D, in the opposite direction. Panels E and F are about having unobserved factors, but a relationship or relationships in both directions at the same time, or a situation where we have just unobserved factors driving the correlation between changes in capital and changes in PD. So what I'm going to do is later, I'm going to run this model with the data, and the computer is going to compare the covariance matrices of the hypothetical scenarios with the matrices from my data set and see which one is more likely to be true. And to decide that, apologize, let me go back to my apologies for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some statistics that can compare those scenarios and see which one is more likely. Okay, my results. Very briefly, Yuli, feel free to, if you have to interrupt, because I might go beyond my time. So when, I just have like 5 minutes, please let me know. The first results are that limited model fixed effects. So I'm going to show you my results for the first equations. So they are in that red rectangle. You can see that I ran regressions for the 4 maturities of PD, changes in PD, which is like 4 time windows. And what we want to check here is delta C, which is in boldface. You see that these numbers in parentheses are the standard errors. And okay, for those who studied the econometrics before, you must have learned a kind of tricky. When you see like regression results with the coefficients and the standard errors, we basically like a very quick calculation we can do. Divide the first number by the second one. If you get around 2, at least 2, they are statistically significant at the levels that we consider in our academic papers. So you can see that in neither case we have like coefficients large enough to be statistically significant. So what's my conclusion here? For none of the 3 capital measures, because here we have those 3 capital measures I showed you before: equity ratio, total regulatory capital, and common equity tier 1, divided into 4 time windows. In neither case we have statistically significant changes in capital as in a relation with changes in probability of default. So, okay, what's our first conclusion based on these initial results? Changes in capital do not have any effect in changes in probability of default. So going back to my results, that's basically what I just told you. Second method, which is, perhaps the most powerful one, assuming that you agree with my instrumental variable. So now my instrumental variable results. First, I show you the results for the first stage, which are in the blue rectangle. you can see that all coefficients for the instrument as related to the changes in capital, like all the measures of capital, are statistically significant. So you can see like stars that are used to show highly statistically significant coefficients. And they are negative. So that's, remember that when I presented my instrument, I said that, okay, when the IV, the number I calculate was too small, we would expect an increase of capital next year. So it means a negative relationship. So we see negative coefficients here, which is in accordance with my prediction. Okay, the most curious people listening to or attending my presentation could think, okay, why in some cases there are two instruments and in some cases there are only one? Okay, I prefer to use two instruments because the more the better. But in some cases, two instruments didn't pass the over-identification test. So there are some statistical tests that we run if more than one instrument work well together. So when that happened to me, when they do not work well together, I just used the instrument based on the mean. But later on, I used other instruments just to check or double check my results. In this case, so let's see our coefficient of interest is delta C, changes in capital. In non-case, we have significant coefficients in the red box here. Again, so we have the same conclusion as before. In my data set, changing capital does not change probability of default, which goes against the kind of the intuition we have nowadays that we should interfere with capital to change probability of default. So here I just described the results I told you before. Okay, now that structural equation modeling. So what have I found when I compared the 6 scenarios I had proposed? So remember that I had 6 panels and I was looking for the smallest number for AIC, which are like information criteria measures or statistics, and BIC. The smallest ones are for panel F. And we have some ties, like equal values in terms of coefficient of determination, because we are looking for the highest one. But considering the 3 criteria, panel F is the best one. So let's see, okay, what's panel F? Is this one, is a situation where we have something that we do not observe, and that thing or things, like in plural, are driving changes in capital and changes in probability of default. So that's the most likely scenario in my data set using structural equation modeling. Additional tests. We call these like robustness tests, meaning that, we try to challenge our initial results by changing things or assumptions we made before. So my measure of stability was probability of default. But we also use credit default swap spreads as a measure of stability. So I tried 5 measures of CDS with the same 3 measures of capital I used before, using the 3 methods I showed before: fixed effects, instrumental variables, and structural equation modeling. And the main results were basically the same. Delta C, or the coefficient of delta C, was not statistically significant. Another possibility was that, okay, the global financial crisis changed the relationship between capital and probability of default. So what I did is I did actually 2 tests. First included a dummy for the 2007, 8, and 9, for the years of the global financial crisis. And then in another test, I simply excluded those years from my data set. Of course, the first solution is much more elegant, but I tried both just to see what happened. And again, in both cases, uh, delta C was not statistically significant in a regression with delta PD or delta CDS, like changes in spreads of CDS. So again, these additional tests confirmed my initial results. I noticed that some countries in my data set didn't have like too many observations. So I used only the countries that had more than 200 observations, just to give us some variation, some pattern. And then again, the results confirmed my initial results. I have a table for these results, tables, but I'm not showing just in interest of time, because I know that I actually have blew up the time, I believe. So I'm going to the final part of my presentation. I also tried additional instruments. For example, just to illustrate one case, instead of using the mean to calculate my instrumental variable, I used the median. So I combined different pairs of instruments, and this gave me 288 models. In 244 models, I had, or I found, statistically significant IVs. In those models, 208 gave me non-significant delta C or even C, I mean changes in capital or capital. So in most of the case, with alternative instrumental variables, I confirmed the initial result. So the final part of my presentation, the second objective, is okay. I mean, I hope I have convinced you that we have strong evidence that capital or change in capital has no impact on probability of default. Then you could ask me, okay, so what? Are we lost? I mean, what can we do? Okay, my suggestion is to check the 6 factors that I actually used in the regression, in my initial regressions, to see if any of them would affect probability of default. I mean, if regulators created the rules, in fact, we have some rules about them, but let's assume if they are more important than capital. Actually, in the first one here, actually is capital again, because I'm using camels. You can see in red is the acronym used by supervisors and regulators. So I'm going to test if each of these factors, if we change those factors, we would cause a change in probability of default. To do that, I need more instruments, not only for capital, which is very hard to find. So I use another method, which is called GMM, and which gives us easier ways of finding instruments. So usually we use lagged variables as instruments, but we have additional statistical tests. So if they pass the statistical tests, we take those instruments as valid. So I did 2 different tests in GMM. You can see in the red box, like just one of each variable or potential factor contributing to stability as endogenous. So just one by one. None of them was statistically significant. So it means that if we change any of these factors, and here we have the 3 measures of capital again, just to double check my results, it seems that they do not affect probability of default. And then in the blue box, I put everyone as endogenous at the same time, which is kind of challenging because I need instruments for all the variables that I consider endogenous, which is all the variables here, capital and the other 5 ones. In this case, it seems that only earnings like profitability, assuming regulators or banks could intentionally change profitability, maybe only in that case we would reduce probability of default. Okay, just to finish my conclusion, try to give some interpretation. So why does capital would not affect stability directly? So the direct link, which seems to be more obvious. Maybe it's because their capital has like potential positive and negative effects on changes in PD, as we said before. At the same time, the capital leads to lower probability of default by definition. When we increase capital, we increase cost of funding for banks. So banks may need to increase risk to increase return and pay the extra cost of capital. So a possibility, which I don't test here, this is for future study, is that the positive aspect of capital is offset by the negative consequence of more risk-taking. So this would support some conclusions in some papers. In terms of if you remember the diagram I showed at the beginning of my presentation, the second explanation for the importance of capital is the skin in the game. So like shareholders being afraid of losing too much money when capital increases. But I'm saying that perhaps this is not important. Why not? Because in my opinion, it seems to be quite natural to think that for shareholders to monitor managers to reduce risk-taking, each shareholder would need to increase her or his own capital participation in the bank. If we add more capital to the bank, but the capital is from other people, those old shareholders would not have motivation or incentives to reduce risk-taking. So actually, I believe that each shareholder or each person would have more motivation to reduce or risk-taking or put pressure on managers if the wealth of shareholders at risk in the bank increased as well. So if the bank increases shares with money of the old shareholders, so perhaps then skin in the game would work. But what we see is when we talk about increases in capital, we are saying that, okay, it's more capital of the bank, not necessarily of the same old shareholders. So perhaps that's why skin in the game doesn't work in this case. So this is related to what we call limited liability. So it means that shareholders only lose what they invest in the banks. So finally, I have shown some evidence that it's possible that changing capital does not impact bank stability, which is very bad news, meaning that there's something else that we do not observe, perhaps regulators don't know about, that would be driving the relationship between capital and instability. I also tried other factors like manager capabilities, asset quality, and it seems that for most of these additional factors, there's no impact in changing them on changes in probability of default. So another bad news. In the final bullet point, this means that we still have a lot of work trying to find out what makes banks safe. So this was my presentation. I can't see anything from the screen now. I'm going to stop sharing because I can perhaps see what's going on in the chat. Wow, there are a lot of Yuli. I have finished my presentation.
Hi, Fernando.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. So, as student of international finance, he asks, when comparing the markets of two or more countries, how can you standardize variables? If regulation is very different in the countries, which are the recommended variables in a model to begin with? I believe these questions make sense with the first part of the presentation.
No, yes. Okay. At least for some of the models, I used what we call country fixed effects. So I totally agree that regulation are totally different. And okay, for those who study international regulations like Basel, we know that Basel is not a law; it's just a recommendation. So banks are free to add or remove parts of the recommendation. So initially, okay, if possible, we can add country fixed effects. So that I mean, okay, at least things that are fixed, we would control for. Um, I controlled more for the economic and financial situation of the countries. You know that I have GDP growth, I have the financial index for the main financial index of uh, each country. But when the student asks, okay, how can you standardize variables? I believe the question is about how to compare, because okay, we can standardize by, I mean, in the statistical sense, by reduce the mean and divide by standard deviation. I don't think that's what the student means. I think he or she asks about how to compare countries with different regulations or different scenarios. I would say that, I mean, the main technique we have available would be to use country fixed effects. That would be, I mean, what comes to my mind right now. Of course, perhaps it's not perfect, but in my defense, I would say that because I used like four methods, in some of them control for bank fixed effects, in other for different variables, in the conclusions are the same. So that might be evidence that the final conclusion might be correct, even if countries are different. And by the way, I mean, for those, especially students who are or need to study, use econometrics for anything like final reports or in their jobs, my suggestion is, I mean, try to use more than one method, because, I mean, methods have limitations. And like for questions like this one, even if one of the methods don't treat that particular limitation, perhaps another method would treat it. So when we have evidence from different methods, the the big picture, the combination of all the models could help you to convince people that your results might be true. Yuli, I hope I have answered the question.
Well, I hope you do answer for that student your question, but it makes sense, all the feedback given the presentation that you had. Fernando, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I know it was available information for the students, very technical, probably for students in the undergraduate level, but very very accordingly to what we expect from them to be learning right now. Thank
No,
you,
yeah,
Fernando.
sorry. I mean, I hope it's useful. I didn't know, I mean, which kind of audience we do have besides the students, but yeah, it might be a little bit beyond the level. But I hope that, I mean, if they are inspired by the importance of banks or by the surprising results, they may be kind of inspired to study this further, even at the undergraduate level, or they could be motivated to take a master's degree or even a PhD if they are crazy enough.
Yes, yes, very, very grateful with your intervention. Thank you, Dr. Fernando Moreira, for this presentation at Cátedra Europa.
No, thank you very much for this opportunity. I have, I mean, it has been beneficial to your students or to other people who are in the audience. So, yeah, so I mean, yeah, I'm glad, I mean, very glad to have taken part in this Europa, Cátedra Europa.
We thank our guests for their special participation and all attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign Más Becas by clicking on the donation button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa's events. Thank you.